guys, Lycoslore here, and in today's experiment we took the ferocious monsters of Monster Hunter and brought them into the 41st millennium. Back in 9th edition, Games Workshop, the owners of Warhammer 40,000, released a bunch of orcs called Beast Snaggas who specialized in using squigs, an organism that originates from the same types of spores as orcs do. And some of these models I was infatuated by, even though I didn't play orcs. So on a whim, I bought a box of Squighog Boyz, and when trying to figure out how I wanted to paint them, I got the idea to paint them after Monster Hunter monsters. I had so much fun painting up these Squighog Boyz this way that against my better judgment, I purchased 1250 points of Beast Snagga Orks. 1250 points was the tournament standard at my local game store, and not only did I purchase this whole army, I wanted to keep the Monster Hunter theme because I'm a longtime Monster Hunter fan. So while I was waiting for my order to arrive, I made a list of what kind of monsters I was going to paint. And then over a year later and countless hours, they are finally finished. The general idea of the army was each pelt and squig was going to be based on a different monster. There are a few squigs and pelts that don't fit this theme, and that is because either I painted them before I decided to go with the Monster Hunter theme, or I personally decided that it was not going to be based on a monster. This batch is the one I love to refer to as the test batch. This was the first box of Squighog Boyz. So when I started painting up this army, I went with the boss knob on Smasha Squig. The squig here is actually not based on any Monster Hunter monster. The idea was this model was going to charge into my enemy lines, and the rest of the army was going to follow him, punching everything they could find, saying Purple Squiggy no punch back. A mix of the games of Punch Buggy and Purple Car Game. I did decide to make his pelt a Monster Hunter monster. I made it based off of the Tigrex, one of my favorite monsters from this franchise. So for the rest of the boys, I wanted monsters that would be easily recognizable and also monsters that I really like. So I went with a Tigrex as the first one. The Tigrex I used as my inspiration, I believe, was from Monster Hunter Stories, so that's why it's more orange than yellow. For the boys themselves, I didn't have a paint scheme yet, so I gave them black boots and khakis, some bone white belts, and just generic white pelts. This would get changed over time, as well as all of their gear and like armor and stuff would be dirty. The other two monsters I went with for this batch were the Dodogama and the Uragon. At the time, I hadn't played World yet, but I did a Dodogama because I have a plushie of a Dodogama, and I thought it was cute enough and I liked it, so I'd give a crack at painting up a Dodogama. And for Uragon, I chose this monster specifically because on this specific model of the squig, it's missing its hind legs and it's replaced with a singular wheel. So my first thought was any monster who could roll up into a ball, I would use them for that model, which unfortunately mainly became variants of Uragon because not a ton of monsters do that. And for the Bomb Squig, I wanted a monster that was relatively small, so I actually went with the Velociraptor Velociprey. They are a smaller monster and they aren't in the more modern Monster Hunter games, so I thought it'd be a fun little blast from the past. The next unit was Mozrog Skragbad. Of all the Beast Snagga Boyz, this was the one who really sold them to me. I saw this guy and went, wow, he is really cool. I like his giant great white squig. I want it. And I have this weird thing with named characters. When I buy them and paint them, I try to paint them as closely to their canon paint scheme as possible. So he does not fit the theme. I really wanted to try to make his squig lifelike, and I don't feel I accomplished that, but it is still one of my favorite orcs that I have. For me wanting to experiment with different units, the next blob I painted was a squad of Beast Snagga Boyz. These guys don't have squigs, but they are still Beast Snagga units. I was still experimenting with color schemes, so I gave them black boots, muddy brown belts, blue jeans, enter a jean stealer joke here, some red metal bits, and different monster pelts. This is when I really decided that I wanted each model in my army to have a different monster pelt, and for the most part I kept this. There are a few exceptions where there are repetition in the pelts. Wanting to paint the last of the different Beast Snagga units, I wanted to paint the kill rig. The squig on this model is the biggest squig big of all the Beast Snagga units, so I wanted to make it special. The monsters I rounded it down to were the Devil Joe and the Brachydios, because they are both brute wyverns, so they are big and tanky. They are also both really fun fights. It was really hard to choose between the two, but I ended up going with Devil Joe. I like Devil Joe a little more than Brachydios. Sorry, Bracky fans. So for the rig itself, I wanted to give this a mismatch of scrap kind of vibe. So I was painting the plates alternating between like copper and steel to try and help give it that vibe. Also on the art, it has these little plates of metal that are traditionally red. As an experiment, I decided to paint them green to see how it would look, and I ended up loving the green so much for not only those plates but also like the bandages on the vehicle that I would use that for the other vehicles as well. There was also a pelt hanging off the back of the word tower. I decided to make that a Brachydios pelt for two reasons. One, in recognition that Brachydios was going to be the other monster that I wanted to paint, and the other was to experiment how I was going to paint the Brachydios. With that pelt looking so good, the moment I get another kill rig, the Squig is going to be a Brachydios. The boys on the rig painted very similar to the other Beast Snagga guys I painted before, except instead of doing like brown, like muddy brown belts or bone white belts, I decided to go with black, just because it was a little easier and I thought it looked nicer. On top of the kill rig, there is a skull tower where a Warboy stands. I gave a shot like trying to paint the eyes of the skull to be blue and magically to try and give a wisp kind of effect. For the Warboy, I decided to replace it with a goth rocker that I had painted a few months prior for a painting contest. I did this for a couple reasons. One, the goth rocker actually does have a squig. It has a amp squig. Two, I wasn't going to use the goth rocker otherwise because the goth rocker was specifically for if you were playing goths, which was a sub-faction of orcs, and I wasn't going to be playing goths because they didn't work well with the Beast Snagga stuff. And three, it ultimately just saves me time, and honestly I think it turned out fantastic. So the second batch of Beast Snagga Boyz, I did basically the same scheme as I did the first batch of Beast Snagga Boyz. Biggest differences being, instead of having like red scraps of metal, I gave them green to kind of match the kill rig. Big thing here was there are shared pelts between the two squads of boys. That being the scaly one with a fin on top, the only monster I could think of with a skin texture like this with a fin was the Plesiop. To help my brain out a little bit and to keep things flowing, I did decide to reuse the Plesiop pelt. The Rukkatrukk Squigbuggies and the Kustom Boosta-blasta, I put these in my list because although they didn't really fit the theme of squigs, they did both have their own uses. The Rukkatrukk Squigbuggy was anti-infantry, and plus I thought the name was hilarious. For the Rukkatrukk Squigbuggy, all of the squigs there look the same, and they are based on the Gigi from Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, which are the baby form of the Giganox. Second blob of Squighog Boyz, the monsters I chose were Tetsukabra, Nargacuga, and Volvidon. And the boss knob was on a Barroth. For the boss knob, admittedly, I did not really have the colors for a Barroth. Against better judgment, I still tried to paint it like a Barroth. Unfortunately, the heads, the models of the Tetsukabra and Nargacuga look very similar. I did not realize the head that I painted up with the Tetsukabra paint scheme was the head that was going to go on the Nargacuga body that I already painted. So I did have to switch some things around, and I did paint over the Tetsukabra with the same blue I was using for the Nargacuga, which actually had a really nice effect because it made the blue dark enough to actually really look like the Nargacuga. Unfortunately, I didn't copy that same method with the rest of the body, so the rest of the Nargacuga's body looks lighter than the head. The Volvidon, originally I was going to do a very simple paint job with just red on top with like an off-white underbelly, but I had a problem with it, and that problem was it was going to look too similar to the Tetsukabra. To counter this, I went really in depth with detail. Actually noticed that the Volvidon's underbelly actually isn't off-white, it's more of like a really light green, so I tried to mimic that effect. I also put the dots on the upper part of it to try and mimic its shell. For the Bomb Squig in the squad, I wanted to go kind of basic, so I went with the classic Jaggy. It's a small monster, they're in every game. Also, I wanted more instances of Jaggy because there is another instance of Jaggy in my army, and that is on the Painboss, as the only thing that this guy has that is close enough to a squig so we're moving on. For the third batch of Squighog Boyz, I wanted to get fancy with it. Two of the monsters I wanted to do were the Kezu and Red Kezu, which are blind. So I needed to fill in those eye holes with something. That's where I got green stuff. I had never played with green stuff before. It's basically a moldable epoxy. After 24 hours, it will fully cure, it's hard as nails, and really easy to work with. This was my first time doing anything with green stuff, so I was really nervous, but looking at the end product, they turned out so well, and I couldn't be happier. The Diablos in this group, I went ham on. Not only did I want to get those big pronounced horns, but I also wanted the rider to have a more monster hunter weapon. So I transformed his big choppa into a type of glaive using the head of a huge choppa from the Beast boss on Squiggosaur, and the bottom end is actually a Kopesh from 8000 Suns model. I even put a little insect on his arm as just a scarab from a Necro model. The Rodamon in this squad also turned out really good. Although his paint scheme was kind of simple, just being primarily black with blue eyes and then just covered in bones, the Citadel box of skulls really brought this model to life. I just covered it with skulls, tried to get like spines and horns, glue them on the model to make it look like how they look on Rodamon. This really did a lot. Again, it looks fantastic. For the Bomb Squig in this squad, since I was really in a Monster Hunter World mood, I decided to paint it like a Shamos, which is a little different because Shamos there isn't a great variant, unlike Jaggy and Velociprey, but it was one I wanted to do because I wanted that color. Those orange eyes to really make it pop, the pink and the gray. I'm proud of this little dude. The last squad of Squighog Boyz. The monsters I chose for this squad were Duramboros, Giganox, Magnamalo, and Merjang. When I was covering the eye holes on the Kezu and the Red Kezu, I decided I wanted to do the Giganox because the Giganox is also blind. It has purple markings on the face that kind of resemble eyes. It even has those same markings on the back of its tail. As you can see, I tried to mimic that as well. You might notice that on its wing, that it's chopped at a diagonal. So what happened was when I made the wing and was letting it cure, unfortunately the tip of the wing kind of bent to a point where I couldn't really use it. So I chopped it to mimic that the wing on the monster was broken like you can do in the game. It's super minor detail, but it adds a lot and really makes this Giganox shine. The boss knob on this squad, I made the Duramboros. I was originally going to do Bamboro. I had a difficult time trying to get those horns right, so I ended up just doing Duramboros, which was a monster from Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate. And here, the horns were a bit of a challenge, but the big challenge I had was the tail. The tail is basically a giant hammer on Duramboros, and I tried to get that same effect. It didn't turn out exactly. The tip of the tail kind of caves in, but despite that indent, it still turned out really good. Duramboros also has a bunch of mushrooms and whatnot growing on it, so I took some of the sticky flowers that I had that I was using for bases and just put some on. And again, it adds a little bit of life to it, and the little details add so much. The Magnamalo Squig, the thing I was kept flip-flopping on was, do I green stuff horns? It was a thought I constantly had, but I ultimately decided no. I didn't want to do green stuff on this model and instead just go really hard on the detail here, because Magnamalo has a lot of detail. The Magnamalo's color palette is just so pleasing to look at. Squighog model is a great canvas for the Magnamalo paint scheme. For the Rajang Squig, some of you might go, oh, Rajang doesn't curl up into a ball. Actually, it does. It has a technique where it jumps up into the air, rolls up into a ball, and basically does like a homing attack from like the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. And here was a challenge because for Rajang's face, I knew it was like a lighter shade, but I didn't know how to get that color, and I didn't have any paints that really look like that. So this is where I really tried mixing paints, which is something I don't really do personally. I thought I saw a color that looks similar to it when I was making the Diablos Squig. So I tried recreating what I did, and it did not turn out right at all. So then I actually went with my light purple and mixed in a little bit of brown. I think it matched pretty darn well. And I wanted to be careful with this paint because I only had a little bit. I wasn't planning on making more. The biggest challenge here for me was the horns, because I was getting self-conscious about horns, because if you look closely at all the horns I've done, they're all lopsided. They are still lopsided, but for me, I'm happy with it. It's the best I could do, I got the general shape for the rider on the Rajang Squig. The pelt on him I was having a hard time thinking of, and then I decided on a Kieran. I tried to stay away from Elder Dragons just because I thought they would be on bigger Squig, but in this case I went with a Kieran pelt because Rajangs eat Kieran horns. So I thought, oh, it would fit because, oh, he probably pulled it off a dead Kieran from this Squig. The Bomb Squig in this squad, I was still in a Monster Hunter World mood. The original plan was I was going to make this a baggie. The baggies are really simple to paint, and I didn't really want to do that, so instead I switched it to a Gyros because they still have a great variant and they are still a small monster. And honestly, I'm really proud with how this little Squig turned out. Heck, I was so pleased with it. When I painted the grot on the Rajang Squig, I made the Squigs that he was firing from his gun also Gyro Squigs. Thank you guys so much for watching. This was a huge passion project and I really wanted to share it. The idea of bringing monsters from Monster Hunter onto the Warhammer tabletop blew me away. This is awesome. Because the editions changed and the point values have changed, I am adding more monsters to this list. I'm probably not going to make an update video of the other monsters I add and the other models. The only reason I would is if there was a huge demand for it and people wanted to see that full 2,000 point list. Thank you guys for letting me geek out, and I'll see you in the next experiment. So as always, friends, good vibes till next time, y'all. Lycos, out.